Welcome back. Before we begin, take a moment and imagine this. A man running through the dark forest, chains still hanging from his wrists, his breath heavy, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from something much older, something buried deep in his blood. Behind him, a master on horseback smiles, believing this is nothing more than another game. Another hunt. Another helpless victim. But what he didn't know was that this man was not born to run. He was born to fight. This story comes from deep research into real historical practices, forgotten tribal histories, and survivor accounts that took countless hours to uncover and piece together. But before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And if you believe forgotten stories deserve to be told, make sure you subscribe and become part of those who refuse to let history stay buried in silence. The master did not see himself as a cruel man. In his own mind, he was powerful, superior, and untouchable. The vast land he owned stretched farther than the eye could see, filled with fields, forests, and human beings he believed existed only to serve him. Over the years, normal punishments had stopped satisfying him. Whips, chains, and cages no longer gave him the same thrill. He wanted something more. Something that made him feel alive. That was when he discovered the hunt. At first, it began as an experiment. One night, he ordered a slave to run into the forest while his overseers waited behind with torches. The man ran in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Then the master mounted his horse, smiled coldly, and gave the order to begin. The overseers released the dogs, and the forest filled with the sound of barking and shouting. The slave's terrified screams echoed through the darkness. When it was over, the master felt something he had never felt before. Not anger, not punishment, but excitement. Word spread quietly among the slaves, carried in whispers during the night. They spoke of the master's new game with fear in their voices. No one knew who would be chosen next. Every sound in the dark made their hearts race. Every time the master appeared, their bodies stiffened with silent dread. He had turned their lives into a waiting nightmare, where survival depended not on obedience, but on whether he was bored. To the master, it was no longer punishment. It became entertainment. He would invite guests to watch, offering them drinks as if it was some grand spectacle. They laughed together as the chosen man was given a head start, pretending to offer him a chance. But it was never a real chance. The master knew the land better than anyone. He knew every tree, every path, every place where hope would die. The master began to believe he was more than just a man. Each hunt fed his ego, convincing him that he was a force of nature itself. He saw fear in the eyes of others, and it made him feel like a god. No one challenged him. No one stopped him. His power grew not only through violence, but through the silence it created. Fear became his greatest weapon, but what the master did not understand was that with each hunt, he was creating something else. Not just fear, but anger. Not just obedience, but resistance. Deep inside those he hunted, something ancient stirred. Something older than chains. Something that could not be broken by whips or controlled by fear. He believed he was hunting animals, but he was blind to the truth. One day, that blindness would cost him everything, because the hunt he loved so much would lead him to choose the wrong man. a man whose blood carried memories older than the master's land, a man whose spirit could not be chased, could not be owned, and could never be hunted like prey. And when that day came, the master would finally understand what it meant to be afraid. The morning he chose his next victim seemed no different from any other. The sun rose slowly over the fields, casting long shadows across the land, and the workers moved in silence, careful not to draw attention to themselves. They kept their heads down, their bodies tense, knowing that at any moment his eyes could fall on anyone. The master stood on the porch of his large house, watching them closely, searching, not for someone strong, but for someone he believed was weak. His gaze moved from one man to another, judging them like objects. Some were old, their bodies worn down by years of labor. Others were young but broken in spirit, their eyes empty from endless suffering. He wasn't looking for a challenge. He was looking for someone who would run in panic, someone who would make the hunt entertaining, someone who would remind him of his absolute power. Then his eyes stopped. There was a man standing near the edge of the field, quiet and still. He wasn't the biggest, he wasn't the loudest. In fact, there was nothing about him that seemed special at all. His clothes were worn, his posture calm, his face expressionless. He worked without hesitation, without complaint. To the master, this made him invisible. And invisible men were the easiest to break. The master pointed at him without saying a word. The overseer immediately understood. He walked toward the man, his boots heavy against the dirt. The others noticed but did not react. They did not dare look. They did not dare speak. They had seen this moment before, and they knew what it meant. The overseer grabbed the man's arm and pulled him away from the field. Still, the man did not resist. He did not beg. He did not ask why. This confused the overseer. Most men trembled. Most men cried or fell to their knees. But this one remained calm, his breathing steady, his eyes focused, not on the overseer, not on the master, but somewhere distant, as if his mind was far away from that place. The overseer felt something strange, something he could not explain. But he ignored it. To him, it made no difference. The master had made his choice. The master watched from a distance, satisfied. To him, this was just another hunt. Just another body running through his land. Just another moment of pleasure to break the boredom of his powerful life. He believed this man would be no different from the others. He believed fear would consume him the same way it always did. But what the master did not see was the silence inside the man. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of control, the silence of someone who had not yet revealed who he truly was. And as the master turned away with a smile, he had no idea that he had just chosen the one man who would change everything. No one on the plantation knew where he truly came from. To them, he was just another man taken from somewhere far away, stripped of his name, his language, and his past. The master never cared to ask. To him, origins meant nothing. A slave was a slave. But long before he stood in those fields, long before chains ever touched his skin, he had belonged to something older, something that could not be erased so easily. He was born in a place where the land breathed with life. Dense forests stretched endlessly, and the air carried the sound of drums that spoke without words. His people were not weak. They were hunters, protectors, and warriors who lived by ancient laws passed from one generation to the next. Strength was not measured by size, but by spirit, and from the moment he could walk, he was taught to listen to the wind, to the earth, and to the silence. As a child, he watched the elders closely. They moved with calm confidence, never wasting energy, never acting without purpose. They taught him how to move through the forest without making a sound, how to see without looking directly, how to feel danger before it arrived. These were not just skills, they were survival. They were part of his blood, part of who he was. His father was not just a man. He was a warrior respected by all who knew him. He carried scars across his body, each one a story, each one a lesson. He taught his son that fear was natural, but it must never control you. Fear is a signal. His father once told him, "It sharpens you, but if you let it rule you, it will destroy you." Those words stayed with him, buried deep inside, waiting for the day they would be needed. Then one day, everything was taken. Strangers came without warning, loud, violent, merciless. Fire consumed the village, and the air filled with screams. He fought as best as he could, but he was still young, still human. He was captured, chained, and forced onto a path that would carry him far away from everything he had ever known. His home disappeared behind him, but what lived inside him could not be stolen. Years passed, and the world tried to reshape him. The chains tried to break his body. The cruelty tried to break his spirit. The master believed he was nothing more than property. But deep inside, beneath the silence, beneath the obedience, the warrior still lived, watching, waiting, remembering. Now, as he stood on the master's land, chosen as the next prey, the past was no longer just a memory, it was awakening. The teachings, the discipline, the blood of his ancestors, they had never left him. The master saw only a tired slave, but hidden beneath that still surface was something far more dangerous. Something the master could never understand, until it was too late. Long before his capture, before the ships, before the chains, his blood had already been shaped by generations of warriors. This was not something written in books or spoken openly to outsiders. It was something felt, something carried silently from father to son, mother to child. It lived in their instincts, in the way they walked, in the way they watched the world around them. It was not taught in a single day. It was passed down over lifetimes. His ancestors had survived countless threats, rival tribes, wild predators, and unforgiving lands. They had learned that survival was not about strength alone, but about patience, awareness, and control. Each generation carried the lessons of the last, refining them, strengthening them. They did not fight without purpose. They did not fear without reason. Their blood remembered what their minds sometimes forgot. As a boy, he did not fully understand what lived inside him. He only knew that he was different. He could sense movement before others noticed it. He could sit in silence for hours, listening to the smallest changes in the wind. While others reacted with panic, he remained calm. The elders saw this and said little, but they understood. They had seen it before. The mark of the warrior was not always visible, but it was always there. His grandfather had once told him a story by the fire. He spoke of their ancestors who faced impossible odds, men who stood their ground when escape was easier. He said their strength did not come from weapons, but from within, the body can be captured. His grandfather said quietly, "But the blood remembers who you are." At the time, the words seemed distant, almost like a legend. Now, they echoed in his mind with terrifying clarity. Even after years of slavery, when his body had been forced into obedience, the blood inside him never changed. It flowed the same way it always had. It carried the same memory, the same strength, the same patience. The masters believed time could erase identity. They believed suffering could erase heritage. But they did not understand that some things lived deeper than pain. There were moments, even in captivity, when it revealed itself in the way he endured without breaking, in the way he observed everything around him without reacting, in the way he conserved his energy while others collapsed from exhaustion. He was not weak. He was waiting. Waiting without even knowing why. Waiting because something inside him told him his moment would come. Now, that moment was close. The master believed he had chosen just another man, just another victim. But he had unknowingly chosen the descendant of warriors who had never truly been defeated. The blood of those ancient fighters flowed quietly through his veins, unchanged by chains, untouched by fear. And soon, for the first time since his capture, that blood would no longer remain silent. The master had long since stopped seeing the people around him as human. To him, they were tools, replaceable, disposable. His power had gone unchallenged for so many years that he no longer questioned it. Every order he gave was obeyed instantly. Every punishment he delivered was accepted in silence. This absolute control fed something dangerous inside him, a belief that he was untouchable, beyond consequence. Each successful hunt only strengthened that belief. He remembered the fear in their eyes, the desperate way they ran, the way hope slowly disappeared from their bodies as exhaustion took over. To him, those moments were proof of his superiority. He told himself that no one could escape him. No one could outthink him. No one could survive him. The land itself, he believed, was on his side. He prepared for each hunt with calm precision. His horse was strong and well-fed. His rifle was cleaned and ready. His dogs were trained to follow any scent without hesitation. Everything was under his control. Everything was predictable. The outcome was always the same. The prey ran. The prey weakened. The prey fell. It had become a pattern he trusted completely. When he thought of the man he had chosen, he felt no concern. He remembered the quiet face, the still posture, the lack of visible fear. To the master, this meant only one thing, that the man was already broken inside, already defeated. He believed the hunt would be easy, perhaps even boring. But that did not matter. The hunt was no longer about challenge. It was about reminding himself who he was. He stood on his porch that evening, watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. The darkness was coming, and with it, his favorite moment. The moment when the prey would be released. He imagined the man running blindly through the forest, driven by panic. He imagined the sound of his breath, the desperation in his movements. It made him smile. In his mind, the outcome had already been decided. What he did not realize was how much he had begun to underestimate those he hunted. His confidence had grown so large that it blinded him. He no longer looked closely. He no longer questioned. He saw what he expected to see: weakness, fear, helplessness. He had forgotten that beneath the surface, something else could exist. Something patient. Something waiting. As the night approached, the master felt only excitement, no doubt. No fear. No hesitation. He believed he was the hunter, as he had always been. He believed nothing could change that. But for the first time since his cruel game had begun, he was wrong. And deep within the man he had chosen, something ancient was beginning to rise, something the master was completely unprepared to face. The night had fully settled when the moment finally arrived. The air was thick and heavy, and the forest stood in complete silence, as if it already knew what was about to happen. The moon hung low behind dark clouds, offering only faint light through the branches. The overseers dragged the man to the edge of the trees, his wrists no longer bound, but the marks of the chains still fresh on his skin. This was the master's ritual: release the prey, give him hope, and then take it away. The master sat tall on his horse, watching closely. His face showed no emotion, only cold anticipation. He studied the man carefully, expecting to see panic, trembling, or desperation. But the man stood still, his breathing slow and controlled. He did not beg. He did not speak. He simply looked into the darkness ahead of him. To the master, this meant nothing. He had seen silence before. He believed it was the silence of defeat. One of the overseers stepped forward and gave the man a cruel choice. "Run," he said quietly. "Run, and you might live longer." The words were not meant as mercy. They were meant as mockery. The forest ahead was vast, filled with shadows and dangers. There was nowhere to truly escape. But still, they gave him the illusion of a chance. That illusion was part of the master's game. For a moment, nothing happened. The man remained where he was, his feet planted firmly on the ground. The night air moved around him, brushing against his face, carrying the scent of trees, earth, and distance. It was the first time in years he had stood unchained beneath an open sky. He closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in awareness. He was not seeing the forest. He was feeling it, listening to it. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. He did not run wildly like the others had. He moved with purpose. His steps were quiet, controlled, deliberate. He disappeared into the darkness without looking back. The overseers watched him go, confused by his calm. The master watched too, his expression unchanged. He was not concerned. The hunt had begun, and in his mind, the ending was already written. The master raised his hand and signaled the start. Time was given, as always. A head start. Enough to make the chase interesting. Enough to give the prey false hope. The dogs waited, restless and eager. The horse shifted beneath him, sensing what was coming. Everything was ready. Everything was familiar. It was a moment he had lived many times before. But deep within the forest, the man was no longer simply running. With every step, something inside him was awakening. His senses sharpened. His breathing remained steady. His fear did not control him, it guided him. This was no longer just escape. This was survival. And for the first time since the hunt began, the master was not chasing a helpless victim. He was chasing something far more dangerous. At first, he moved deeper into the forest without rushing, allowing his body to adjust to the darkness. His feet touched the ground carefully, avoiding dry branches and loose stones. Every sound mattered. Every movement had a purpose. He was not thinking like a man fleeing in panic. He was thinking like something else. something older. The forest did not feel like an enemy to him. It felt familiar. His ears listened closely to the silence around him. He could hear the distant cry of night animals, the soft movement of leaves, and the faint whisper of the wind passing through the trees. These were not distractions. They were signals. They told him where he was, what surrounded him, and what might be coming. His breathing slowed even more, becoming steady and controlled. Panic would waste energy. Panic would make mistakes. Memories began to return, not as clear images, but as feelings. He remembered walking through forests like this long ago, guided by elders who never needed to speak loudly. He remembered how they taught him to trust his senses, not his fear. They taught him that survival was not about running faster, but about thinking clearly. Those lessons had been buried beneath years of suffering, but now they were rising again. He reached down and touched the earth briefly, feeling its texture beneath his fingers. It grounded him. It reminded him that he was not helpless. The chains were gone. The master was far behind, still believing he was in control. But here, in this moment, the forest belonged to no one. Not to the master. Not to the dogs. Not to fear. It belonged only to those who understood it. He began to change the way he moved, stepping where the ground was softer, where his tracks would be harder to follow. He avoided open spaces and stayed close to the shadows. He was no longer simply escaping. He was thinking ahead. Thinking like the hunters from his past had taught him. Every decision mattered now. Every second mattered. For the first time since his capture, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Not hope. Not yet. But control. His mind was clear. His body was no longer reacting blindly. It was responding with purpose. The fear that once lived inside him had transformed into awareness. It sharpened him, strengthened him, guided him. Behind him, far in the distance, he knew the master would soon begin the chase. The dogs would be released. The horse would follow. The hunt would truly begin. But the man moving through the darkness was no longer the same man who had stood in chains. With every step, the teachings of his ancestors grew stronger inside him. And for the first time, the hunter and the hunted were no longer so different. Something shifted deep within him as he moved through the forest. It began as a subtle awareness, a flicker of recognition that the fear he had carried for years was no longer controlling him. The panic that once twisted his stomach and clouded his mind was replaced by something heavier, sharper, and more deliberate. He could feel the ancient rhythm in his blood, the pulse of warriors who had faced far worse than any master's cruelty. Every sound around him became a signal. The rustle of leaves was no longer a random distraction. It was a message. The snapping of a twig could reveal the approach of the master or the dogs. Even the wind carried meaning, telling him where to step, when to pause, and when to move with lightning precision. He was no longer reacting blindly. He was calculating, planning, and anticipating. His muscles, once weakened by years of confinement and labor, now remembered strength. Each stride through the forest was powered not by desperation, but by purpose. The skills buried deep within him since childhood, lessons passed down from father to son in a line of warriors, had returned with terrifying clarity. He could feel his reflexes sharpening, his senses extending beyond what any ordinary man could perceive. Memories of the tribal teachings began to merge with instinct. He recalled the stories of his ancestors standing against impossible odds, never fleeing when the outcome seemed hopeless. He felt their courage coursing through him now, ancient and unyielding. Each memory reminded him that survival was not a matter of running alone. It was about asserting dominance, controlling fear, and using the environment to one's advantage. His heartbeat slowed, matching the rhythm of the forest around him. Fear had transformed into a quiet, powerful alertness. His mind was no longer clouded with doubt or panic. Every decision he made, every step he took, was precise. The hunter could not yet see it, but the hunted was no longer the same man who had been chained and broken. Something inside him had awakened, something that had waited his entire life for this moment. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Birds hushed their calls, small creatures paused in their burrows, and the air felt charged, almost alive. It was as if the forest itself recognized that he was no longer running like a prey. He moved with authority now, not just surviving but asserting himself in the world around him. His fear had become power. And in that moment, the man understood something essential. The hunt had changed. No longer was it merely about escape. It was about awakening. The fear that had once held him captive had been transformed into something unstoppable. He was no longer a man to be chased. He was a warrior reborn, and the master would soon learn the cost of underestimating what lay hidden in bloodlines long forgotten. The master had expected to see the same panic he had always seen, the same frantic movements and desperate mistakes. But as he followed the faint tracks of the man through the forest, he began to notice something strange. The movements were too precise, too controlled. The footsteps avoided loose branches. The marks in the dirt were calculated, not chaotic. It was unlike anything he had seen before. He tightened his grip on the reins, scanning the shadows between the trees. Every rustle, every snap, every hint of movement made him alert, but there was no fear in the man he was chasing. The master had grown used to seeing terror reflected in the eyes of those he hunted. This calmness unsettled him more than any resistance ever could. Something was different. Something was wrong. The dogs, trained for speed and aggression, seemed confused as well. They picked up the scent and followed, but their movements were hesitant, unsure. Even they sensed it. The master frowned, a twinge of irritation creeping into his mind. How could a simple prey move with such discipline? He had faced stubborn men before, but they eventually broke. They always did. Or so he thought. He leaned forward in the saddle, scanning the darkness for signs of weakness. Every instinct screamed at him that this should be an easy chase. And yet, instinct alone was not enough. The man he was pursuing seemed to anticipate each movement, each calculated step, as if he were reading the master's mind. It was unnerving. For the first time, the hunter realized he might not be in full control. The forest itself seemed to aid the hunted. He moved with an awareness that allowed him to vanish into shadows, to bend the terrain to his advantage. The master had mapped every inch of this land, knew every path and shortcut, yet the man was always one step ahead. The realization struck slowly but firmly. He was facing someone who did not belong to the world of fear he controlled. His confidence began to waver, replaced by irritation, then a creeping sense of dread. He had always been the predator, and everyone else had been prey. But now, the roles were uncertain. The man he was chasing moved with purpose, using strategy and instinct instead of panic. He was no ordinary slave. He was something else entirely. By the time the master recognized the truth, it was too late. The man he thought would break under pressure was not only surviving, he was dominating the environment. Every step, every decision, every movement was calculated to turn the tables. The hunter had been drawn into a game he did not understand, and the hunted man, carrying the blood and teachings of ancient warriors, was ready to claim his power. Fully expand detalis no heading 7 paragraph keynote 10. The shift inside him was complete. The fear that had once gripped him during years of captivity was gone, replaced by a focused clarity that sharpened every sense. He was no longer reacting blindly to danger, he was anticipating it, predicting it, and using it to his advantage. Each heartbeat, each breath, each step through the forest was precise, deliberate, and controlled. The hunted had become the strategist. He began to move differently, no longer simply running. His posture, his balance, even the placement of his feet reflected the training of generations he had inherited without realizing it. The lessons from his ancestors, how to stalk, how to read terrain, how to use fear as a weapon, were all resurfacing. What once had been instinct in the wild, now merged with the acute awareness of the present. He was no longer just surviving, he was preparing to fight. The master, riding behind, was still confident, still believing that his prey was weak and frightened. He did not see the transformation that had taken place. Every twitch of a leaf, every shift in the wind, every distant sound was being analyzed by the hunted man. He could tell when the dogs were approaching, when the master adjusted his pace, and when the overseers were trying to flank him. The tables were quietly turning. As he moved, he allowed himself to draw upon more than just instinct. Memories of his childhood, of lessons from elders, of stories of warriors facing impossible odds, they all fueled him. He remembered how they had taught him patience, observation, and the importance of timing. Each movement through the forest became a tactical decision. No longer was he merely running, he was maneuvering, positioning himself for what was coming. His senses were now attuned to the environment, as if it were an extension of his body. He could feel the ground beneath his feet, detect subtle changes in air pressure, even sense distant movements before they happened. Every step became an act of mastery, and with it, his confidence grew. He was no longer a hunted man at the mercy of others, he was a force to be reckoned with. The mental shift had also transformed his emotions. Fear no longer dominated him. Instead, a controlled fury burned quietly inside, a focus born from injustice and survival. He realized that the master's arrogance, his overconfidence, and his complete underestimation of the hunted had created an opportunity. Now, it was not just about escaping. It was about reclaiming power. By the time he reached a narrow clearing, it was clear that the hunted man was no longer prey. He moved with the calm, controlled confidence of someone trained for battle his whole life. Every instinct, every memory, every ounce of strength had fused into a single, unstoppable force. The master, blind to the awakening that had taken place, was about to face a confrontation unlike anything he had ever imagined. The hunted had become the warrior, and the hunter would soon learn that some bloodlines cannot be broken. The confrontation came quietly, almost unexpectedly. The master, confident in his years of power and control, had tracked the man deeper into the forest. He expected to catch him off guard, to strike fear into his heart, as he had done countless times before. But when he finally saw him, standing in a small clearing, something about the man's posture, the calm in his eyes, sent a jolt through him. This was no ordinary prey. The man did not flee. He did not hesitate. Instead, he met the master's gaze directly, unflinching. Every instinct the master had relied on for dominance, the fear in the eyes of the hunted, the chaos in their movements, was absent. In its place was a stillness that radiated power. It was a presence that spoke without words, commanding the forest itself to watch and obey. The master realized too late that he was facing someone entirely different. The dogs, sensing the change, hesitated. Their barks faltered, their paws paused mid-step. Even they could feel that this was no ordinary chase. The hunted man moved with authority now, as if the forest had become an extension of his body. Every step he took was calculated, every glance measured. The master had underestimated him completely, and the forest seemed to confirm it, swallowing his confidence in silence. The master tried to assert control as he always had. He raised his hand, shouted commands, and urged the dogs forward, but nothing worked. The hunted man anticipated every move, dodging, weaving, and positioning himself in ways that made the master feel unsteady. For the first time, he doubted. For the first time, he felt the creeping tendrils of fear coil around his chest. The hunter was becoming aware that the game had changed entirely. Then the man struck, not with weapons, but with precision and instinct. Every motion was deliberate, meant to disarm and unbalance. He forced the master to react, to stumble, to question his decisions. It was a mental battle as much as a physical one, and for every move the master tried, the hunted man had already anticipated it. The master's arrogance, his confidence built over decades, began to crumble under the weight of this awakening. The air seemed charged with tension, thick and electric. The forest held its breath. The master, who had always believed himself untouchable, realized that he was no longer in control. The hunted man had transformed into something ancient and unstoppable, his bloodline guiding every action. What had started as a game, a sport for the master's amusement, had now become a reckoning. By the time the confrontation reached its peak, it was clear who held the power. The hunted man, drawing on every lesson, every memory, every instinct passed down through generations, stood as a warrior reborn. The master, for all his arrogance and cruelty, faced a force he could not dominate, could not predict, and could not break. The tables had turned, and the hunter would soon understand that some bloodlines carry power that fear and chains can never extinguish. Even after the confrontation ended, the story did not fade. The forest whispered it to those who came near, carrying the legend of a man who could not be hunted, a man whose blood carried the memory of warriors long past. The master, once feared by all, became a cautionary tale, his arrogance remembered only as a warning. The man had survived, but more than that, he had become immortalized in the memory of those who witnessed it. Word spread quietly, first among the remaining slaves who spoke in hushed tones, careful not to draw attention. They told of a man who had faced certain death and emerged unbroken, whose presence alone could command respect and fear. Some claimed that the master's estate never recovered from that night, as if the air itself had been tainted by the awakening of something greater than cruelty. The man himself did not speak much of it. He returned to the forests, to places where the earth remembered his ancestors and where his own spirit could breathe free. Yet the master's power, once absolute, had been shattered. Every step he took afterward was haunted by the knowledge that his reign of terror had been undone by a force he could neither understand nor control. Stories grew over time, shaped by fear and awe. Travelers and local villagers began to tell tales of a warrior who appeared when injustice reigned, a man who carried the strength of generations in his blood. He became more than a survivor, he became a symbol that no matter how deep the chains or how cruel the master, the spirit of a true warrior could never be broken. Even decades later, the forest seemed alive with his presence. Those who entered it spoke of strange sounds, fleeting shadows, and an almost invisible guide that led the lost or punished the cruel. The memory of the hunt, and the man who turned it around, became part of the land itself, as if his ancestors had returned through him to reclaim justice that had long been denied. The master, eventually forgotten by the world outside, remained a lesson etched into history. His cruelty had seemed absolute, but it had never accounted for the legacy of blood, courage, and instinct flowing through a single man. That legacy had changed everything. It had rewritten the rules of the hunt, proving that the hunted could become the hunter, and that power built on fear was fragile when faced with something far older and stronger. And so the story lived on, not just in whispers or warnings, but in the hearts of those who understood the truth courage and heritage can awaken at the most unexpected moment. The blood of ancient warriors is not easily tamed, and those who carry it can transform the world around them. The master had hunted for sport, but he had unknowingly created a legend, a man who would never be forgotten, whose power and spirit outlasted even the cruelty that once sought to destroy him. You're using a less powerful model until your limit reaches.